So, hello and welcome to this month's Teacher Chit Chat about a lot of different things, but really about teaching in these times. So, it's currently June 2023, and so much has changed over the last couple of years in the yoga world. And I think that some of these changes we were seeing already pre-pandemic. There were organizations like Yoga Glow that were already had a pretty big presence online, and you were starting to see that pop up at different studios, some streaming, some videos, personalized apps, things of that nature, and maybe even like across the fitness world. And then, of course, the pandemic was kind of like a slingshot into the online world pretty rapidly. In some instances, probably pretty unexpected. This was a transition that was really layered for students, for studios, and for teachers. And there's pros and cons to all of that, which we'll get into a little bit in this chat tonight, but also just looking at how yoga has changed over the last couple years, what it means to hold space for people in their process, and also over the last 5 to 10 years, looking at yoga teacher trainings and certification process and what feels important to really analyze and be considerate of as more and more as yoga has become more and more mainstream. So a couple of these areas intersect, and I'm just gonna start talking about some of them. I will also put some links in the video notes that you can access some teachers that I think are pretty good resources. So let's start with lineage and tradition. Our world is moving so quickly that it can be really easy to bypass some of the hard work of honoring tradition. When we look at lineage and tradition, we can also bring into the conversation cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. And one of the things that comes up for me when I think about lineage, well, there's a couple things that come up. So oftentimes when there's a topic that feels like hard for me to tackle or hard for me to understand or really get overwhelmed by the bigness of it all, I try to make it really much smaller and how it relates to my world or an analogy that would be appropriate in my world. So when I think about lineage and tradition, I think about just some different rituals and traditions in my own family. I grew up in an Irish, Italian, American household. And so there were things that we were used to doing every year for holidays, for birthdays. And I look at how that has been passed on to my nieces and nephews and what pieces of that still really work, what pieces of that we have left behind, what pieces of that feel really sacred and special to honor my family. I also think about, I grew up in a Catholic household, as I just said. So I went to Catholic school from preschool to through high school. And I look at that tradition and my relationship to that tradition and things that have been revealed about that tradition. And I say both of these things, right, because we do have spiritual traditions that we're a part of, or religious traditions that we're part of. We have cultural and familial traditions that we're all a part of. And there's this delicate balance, I think, of having a tradition like yoga, which is a living, breathing tradition, and looking at how it has evolved to fit who we are currently as human beings, the state of the world that we're in, just how we operate in the world that is a lot different than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, and 1,000 years ago. And the places where that has really served us, that that tradition is alive. And so it's evolving with us. Whereas we look at some traditions, and I can only speak to my own experience. And so you may agree or disagree with this, but I'll use the Catholic Church again. This is a tradition that feels really stuck and in a really like a black and white space around right and wrong, and is just not evolving, not living and breathing with who we are as a people, as a humanity, with the resources, the knowledge, the information that we have today. It's like stuck in 2,000 years ago and isn't willing to negotiate, change, or shift some beliefs and ideologies that really are very exclusive. And so I don't necessarily have a clear-cut answer on lineage and tradition and appropriation and appreciation. What I do encourage is a ton of self-reflection around this, and some specific practices. So, and this comes into like one of the other things in this chat too, of like, are we practicing with one teacher, or are we practicing with many teachers? So I think one of the best ways that we can honor lineage and the lineage and tradition of yoga, of course, is some academic study, some historical studies, but in a way that's super applicable for us is to continue to be a student of yoga and to bring that studentship into your teaching. And what I mean by that is teaching more than just asana, teaching more than just poses. So the asana piece of the practice is the piece that has been wildly westernized. And the other pieces of practice, which have always been as important, if not more important, in the spiritual discipline that is yoga, have been left aside. So we can do asana, and asana is important. And right, there are these other aspects. So pranayama, meditation, the yamas and niyamas that we can dive into. And by bringing that into our practices and naming that, as well as perhaps naming that lineage or naming that teacher, that's a way of honoring it. If you've been practicing with the same teacher for a while, it could be a really worthwhile experience to find out more about who they have studied with, who their teachers are, and what that lineage comes from. So whether it's in a lineage of Ashtanga yoga, whether it's a lineage of Iyengar yoga, whether it's Kundalini yoga, right? Who are you studying with, and who have they studied with? Right? Go find your teacher's teachers. Like, the closer we can get to the source, because we are getting further away from that as things, again, just get westernized or watered down. I also think it's an important thing to kind of discuss and talk about is my experience is that many yoga practices now are a blend of things other than just yoga. So whether it's different types of movement, whether it like mobility, cars, hula hooping, right? Whatever the thing is. There are different movement practices that are being woven into the yoga practice, and there are different thought traditions or philosophical traditions or religious or spiritual traditions that are being woven into yoga. And so again, I think in honoring the tradition of yoga, it's to name that these other practices are influencing the way that you teach yoga. So for example, I taught a yin teacher training the beginning of 2023. And one of the first things that I do, and it's on my my manual, is I name my teachers and anybody whose work has inspired the work that I'm about to teach. This includes people that are not yogis, right? So for example, I'm really inspired by author Megan Watterson, by Father Richard Rohr, by the poet John O'Donohue, by the trauma-informed trainings I've done outside of the yoga world, right, with different academic organizations. That all comes into the lens through which I'm teaching yoga. And so it's important for me to name, here's where I learned this, here's where I learned this for. So for example, from my trauma studies, I've learned X, Y, and Z about the nervous system. And in my experience of being a student of yoga, this pranayama practice can help with this exact same thing that we're talking about in trauma-informed studies, right? So sometimes there's space to do this in a really elegant way, or rather a more elaborate way. So like I said, a teacher training, I'm able to kind of write that out a little bit more. There's opportunity to like dive deeper into that material and conversation with students. And that's not necessarily always the case in an open or public class. So what I would say is that if you have a website, to make sure that, that it's on there somewhere. Of course, if you're like quoting anybody's work, there are different ways that you can bring it in. So for example, there's a specific Kriya exercise that I learned from Nikki Myers that people love when I teach it. And I always say, I learned this from one of my teachers, Nikki Myers, because it's something that people really, really like and ask for a lot. And I really want to make sure that she gets credit for it. And she may have learned it from somebody else as well, So just doing the best that we can to be true to the practice of yoga, to be true to our studies as students, to be true to the totality of the philosophical and spiritual practice of yoga, to name our teachers, to try to study with our teachers, and to be clear about this as you work with your studentship. For me, I think there's nothing wrong with weaving these different practices together. Again, as long as you're naming it, right? I think it is one of the advantages of the world that we live in, where information is so accessible for us, where it's easier to study with teachers that are further away or have different experiences or backgrounds, that there's a perspective that we can resonate with, and we have access to that now. So it's part of it being a living, breathing tradition. And we're just working to name it. We're working to appreciate it. We're working to acknowledge it. That also means taking time with your studies, right? So one of the thin lines between appropriation and appreciation is not just learning something one time and having an experience with it, and then going ahead and repackaging it, repurposing it, teaching it. So like spending time with those practices, if it's appropriate to ask permission to share those practices. And again, to learn more about their background and their history. So that, I think, is an important thing where, I just said that there is this interesting dynamic, or the world that we're living in is interesting because there's so much at our fingertips. And there's pros and cons to this, just like everything else, right? We're living through a time where it's hard to, we're having to do a lot of like wading through the waters of information and figuring out what is real, what is not real, what is truth, what is different disinformation. It's very easy for people to position themselves as a leader or an expert in a field. It's very easy to have a kitschy Instagram page and good lighting and a good microphone and trendy colors, and for that to have a certain sort of impact on the viewer or the student or you that doesn't necessarily correlate with that person's experience or integrity. So while I think that there are, hold on, someone's coming in right now. Hi, Janine. So while I think that there's a great benefit of being able to have access to a lot of different teachers, I also think it's the same thing where some research needs to be done. And again, speaking to my own experience, I think the best way to really dive into studies as well as hone your skill as a teacher is to practice with the same teacher for a while. That might be a year, that might be 10 years, right? There's a discernment that will happen when you recognize that maybe you've outgrown that teacher, or there's something that doesn't align anymore, or maybe you just don't have access to that teacher anymore. But that helps keep Lineage alive. That helps keep that like appreciation for what's happening in the practice alive. And that helps you just dive into and get to know the material or the philosophies or the techniques much more deeply in your own body, in your own experience, which then of course is going to have impact as how you show up as a teacher. And again, like there's a weight to all of this. You know, I don't have, well, it's interesting, right? Now before I would practice with one of my main teachers, maybe like one time a year, because that's all I could afford to travel to see her or etc. And then the pandemic happened and everybody's online, and I could have access to this teacher all the time. And that doesn't necessarily resonate with me. I like being able to go on deep dives with this teacher for like a weekend or a training or a retreat. So there's a discernment that happens on your own level. And I do think it's fine to be practicing with other teachers. Our body likes different types of movement. There's a lot of different reasons why we might do this. Sometimes we find ourselves in a rut in a practice. And so practicing with a bunch of different teachers just kind of helps us recalibrate to where we are now in our bodies and our practice, and where we want to sit and stay for a while. So whether that's learning more alignment and anatomy, whether that's spending more time in meditation, or hanging out with a teacher for a while who's teaching a lot of subtle anatomy. So again, there's just ways to kind of play with this. Which then kind of leads into this next thing, which is, you know, and this came up a lot for me when I was teaching my yin teacher training this fall, is like a lot of questions around what type of certifications or credentials, or how do I get hired as a yoga teacher? And again, there's pros and cons to everything. I will be honest and transparent. That I haven't had a Yoga Alliance certification or credentials, or I haven't subscribed to that organization for 8 years, 9 years. And in that time, I have taught teacher trainings, taught workshops, etc. During that time period, I also owned a studio. And so I have the perspective that I bring to this is as a teacher myself, and then also as a studio owner who was hiring teachers. So my experience with Yoga Alliance is that it's really just an organization of that is trying to organize professionals in a database and a directory. They are not They're not a certifying organization. So they have recommendations for how to set up teacher trainings, but there's really no, what's the word I want to use? Um, there's really no like follow up after that. There's no standard, there's no regulation. And so for me, it just felt like I was going above and beyond what Yoga Alliance was requiring anyway, that I could no longer justify paying fees and things like that. But I say that because as a studio owner, um, I never not hired someone because they didn't have a Yoga Alliance certification. So much of the hiring process was based on experience. How long have you been a student? How long have you been a teacher? Tell me about your teaching experiences. Where were they? Who were they with? What have you done for as continuing education? What is your focus? And then, of course, a practice to be able to see how this teacher taught, and whether or not only was that person experienced to be able to be teaching those things, but also was that person the right fit for the community that we had at the studio. So the way you could get trainings and trainings and trainings and trainings out the wazoo and have all of these certifications behind you, but if you've never actually taught an hour of yoga, in my opinion, it doesn't really matter in terms of being a teacher, right? So in terms of being a student, like I love taking trainings, I love taking certifications. But for when it comes to teaching, I've always looked at experience first before any of the credentials or things of that nature. That being said, again, it's a little bit of it depends. So there are certain fields and professions that might absolutely require it, or some sort of certification. So, for example, if you want it to be in a hospital setting, and teaching a therapeutic style of yoga, they might require that you have Yoga Alliance certification to a certain hour, 500 hour. They just like they might require that you have CPR training, or that you have some sort of medical training or trauma training, or that you are accredited with the I think it's the International Yoga Therapists organization. So it kind of depends on where you work. For the most part, I don't think it matters if you have a Yoga Alliance certification. So that's that. And yeah, I just want to pause there because Janine, you popped on and you heard some stuff, you didn't hear some stuff. But I wanted to, especially since it's just you and me, I was giving that lecture to the ethers, to be able to take some specific questions or things that you're really curious about.
Oh, yeah, thanks. And, I look forward to catching up since I had to pop in late. I look forward to catching up on some of those other, the little agenda that you had in the email, all of it. I just kind of want to drink it all in. That's where I'm sitting. And with this, joining at the teacher, into the teacher membership, for this, because I don't know, I just feel I'm at a place where I really want to keep my yoga teacher life present, since it's a very small slice of my overall life right now. I think it's easy for me and how I'm going through it right now to sort of, it just becomes this small thing. And I'm pretty like in the groove with the class that I teach. I'm pretty in the groove with it. So I quite honestly, I'm not spending a huge amount of time with it, like on planning it. Like it's a really important and fulfilling part of my week. But I just want to keep remembering the depth of, the reasons why I wanted to, become a yoga teacher, the reasons why I want to be in community with yoga teachers. So anyway, that's just part of my way to say, I'm thankful for this space. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And the couple things that I just jumped in on just now that I'm feeling some relationship to. I came in when you were talking about honing skills by working with one teacher for a while.
Mhm.
And I find that I really relate to that. And I have found that that's what I've done throughout my life. And as you
Mhm.
mentioned, like at different parts of my life, I have been attracted to different teachers or different teaching styles based on whatever it was they were offering. But when I really think of my trajectory in the form, it's
Mhm.
like, oh, it was Michelle, and then, oh, it was Allison, and then, oh, it was, and it sort of
Mhm.
kept, and I moved around a fair bit. So that also had to do with geography. But I think it's amazing to be able to go deep with a teacher like that, like you're saying. And that's another reason why I'm glad to be here in this
Mhm.
mentorship relationship with you. I'm excited to see what it can bring, and being part of the studio membership online as well.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm. I think when I think about like Sean Korn being my like first primary teacher, there have been other teachers that have been just as impactful for me that I've studied with, but I got to all of them via Sean because of like the path that I was on with Sean, and whether it was because it was someone that it was one of her teachers or somebody that she held in high regard, or from working with Off the Mat Into the World when that was still like in person intensives, like the other teachers that they brought in, like they were teaching different things, but it was all complementary. And the only reason I got there to begin with was because of Sean. And so she was always that anchor that I couldn't wait to return to be like, okay, what's this going to reveal for me next? Which wasn't necessarily always with her, but it was someone that it was in that there was just that intersection. So yeah, I think it's interesting. And I'm not teaching or owning a studio, because I'm not teaching in the studio world anymore or owning a studio anymore. I'm really curious in this new world, like how much that's still happening, because there haven't been a lot of, all of the big teachers, like everything just got just so was so different over the last couple of years. There weren't trainings, there weren't intensives, there weren't retreats. The bigger teachers weren't traveling and being hosted by different studios across the country. And so I'm curious if people that are newer to the practice or have like what their anchor is, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me of the connection too to something I think you probably talked about earlier too, which is this the difference between practicing online and practicing in person. And
Mm-hmm.
I have and teaching. And so I just have a lot of thoughts for myself as a student and as a teacher that I would love to connect more on with other teachers. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, as a student, when starting to do online yoga during the pandemic was a huge challenge for me. I still have like being on camera issues that are like I become distracted um,
Mm-hmm.
by that experience as a
Mm-hmm.
student in particular. Um, but it really became this huge gift to me to really like journey through a class in the way that my body told me to, like
Mm-hmm.
the act of listening to my own body by taking online classes um just
Mm-hmm.
like exploded, because
Mm-hmm.
I just felt so much freedom and autonomy and like inspiration of what was in my own body. So I would choose what to
Mm-hmm.
do and what not to do. I would do it in my own way. Maybe I would just be in Shavasana. And it was just so different from the way I was used to practicing.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, I mean, I think that I was somewhat intuitive about like listening to my body. I certainly remember prior to that time, like choosing what cues I might take in and what ones that I might not, because let's be honest, I'm sure all of us have been in classes where we feel like we may receive cues that are not safe or not, just not right for our bodies. So I was already in the practice of doing that, but this was a whole new world. And now, because of partially my work schedule and my commute schedule, I don't practice in person very much still.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do, it's almost like I'm still coming back into this like community yoga body in the room, which is also super inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that I push myself in ways that are, I find healthy ways, I hope, to push myself, that, you know, it feels good to be in the room with other bodies, but it's almost like I'm still getting back into that in my body.
Mm-hmm.
So I've learned such different things from, we
Mm-hmm.
mentioned this at the chat last week, that like, it's almost like two totally different
Mm-hmm.
forms.
Mm-hmm.
And as a teacher, that definitely feels true as well, because
Mm-hmm.
having done both online and in-person teaching now as well, I feel like the way I have to approach a class is just completely different. Like, it feels careless to me almost to to have the same class plan for in-person and online,
Mm-hmm.
because there are so many different factors that have to be taken into account when it comes to the camera and the video, and, you know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
how the students can receive the information visually,
Mm-hmm.
by, you know, verbal cueing, all of that. Like, it just, everything is different. And I'm also, I think I'm still getting used to that. Where in the class, we're in an in-person class, I feel like, okay, I can get a little more into my improvisational self.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't worry about it. If like, maybe if I actually, let me show you it in this direction, if I need to like move my body for people to see what's happening, or whatnot. Whereas online, that can create a whole, like, it feels much more cumbersome. And the
Mm-hmm.
care that needs to be taken to just allow for the students to have the best experience seems like a pretty different, it just feels like a different world.
Yeah, totally. Oh my God, you just named so many good things. And I do feel like they're so different. I feel like they're just totally different practices. And I think one of the things that I learned, I don't know how long it took me to learn it in the pandemic, because in the beginning of the pandemic, I really, and maybe I shouldn't say the beginning, maybe it was like a year in, I was really, and you've heard me say this before, I was really resistant to like practicing online and teaching online and et cetera. But at some point, and this is why I think like teachers being students is so helpful. Like I started realizing like, so I would get to an online class and then it was just a great container for me to then like start and then find myself in like whatever movement and flow I needed to do. So I could be attending a online vinyasa class, but what I'm really doing in my home is restorative yoga, you know what I mean? And just like woof. And when I started realizing that, I think, and then naming that as a teacher, like, you know, so many people were like, yeah, I'm doing the same thing at home, right? And there's a beauty to that because, I mean, part of what we're trying to do with yoga is for people to be really tuned into themselves and their bodies. And no matter how many times you offer that, right, in a live studio class, maybe it's a little bit different now if you practiced all online the whole pandemic and now you're going back into the studio, maybe now you have that confidence to take more breaks, take different variations than you did before. But like before, like there's still a psychology to the classroom and to students that the teacher could cue that to you as many times as he or she wanted. And yet students want to be led, right? Students want to be told what to do. And I think that there's pros and cons to that because people are tired from work, they don't want to make their own decisions, you know, et cetera. But I also think there was a dependency on the teacher instead of that turning inward to the self. And, you know, Janine, one of the things that was like always funny at Yoga Home, because Carrie and I, like we would teach, take breaks, take Shavasana. I mean, but we would also do it as we would do it as students. And I think in the beginning, I mean, there were times where Carrie and I would pop into like a lunch class, and like 3 minutes into class, we're like in Shavasana for like the whole class or child's pose. And I think in the beginning, or students that were newer to the studio, but people that felt comfortable with us would be like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm totally okay. It's just like just what I needed to do." And and if I'm being totally honest, like I'm as a teacher, I'm down with that, right? I'm down with like, just lay there, just go put your legs up the wall, like just be here, be in this container, breathe. But if somebody started doing a completely different physical practice, there's it could be distracting, right? It could be distracting to me, it could be distracting to the other students around them, whether it's the practice of just doing a bunch of handstands, or if it's like somebody's just doing something completely different, right? So I say all of this because I do think there is this like pro of having both, right? To be home and to be in your own body, and whatever class you sign up for online, but then whatever happens is amazing. And for me as a student, there's a there's a depth to the practice that I feel like I'm not getting unless I'm in a live experience. And some of that is that community feel, right? That community pulse. You were talking about like teaching from a teacher standpoint, teaching online and teaching in studio, and it being so different, and it is. And my experience was often that to a certain degree, especially if there's regular students like practicing with the teacher all the time, like those students know what I'm going to say next, they know my language, they know my sequencing, that they're teaching the class as much as I am. So I can be walking around the room and not demoing the way that I have to do now online, because I know 75% of the people in the front of the room know what Warrior One is. So everybody's watching them. So there's just this really dynamic, it just adds a dynamic to the teaching experience when you have all these different bodies in the room. And the same thing, if they see other people taking breaks or rests or different variations, it empowers them to do the same. And that's missing online, right? Like you have to stay in front of the camera. You have to stay in front of the camera.
Yeah, that opens up this whole other thing that I would love to get into maybe in more than the 5 minutes that we have at some point, but
Mm-hmm.
which is so well the communities that I've been teaching are and that I'm interested in, have a large interest in teaching right now, tend to be a lot of older adults.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe folks with some degree of mobility issues, or maybe it's their first time taking yoga, and so I'm working on adaptive practices, things like
Mm-hmm.
this. The class that I teach in person is a restorative class,
Mm.
and I teach at the YMCA, the local, which
Mm.
is great. It's really great. The people that walk into that class are like, it's just so different from going to this is, it's very different from the studio environment.
Yeah.
And I just love it. It's people from all walks of life and all body types and ages sort of come into the room, and I think that's really inspiring. And so what I'm noticing, so I'll take the in-person class as an example. What I'm noticing is that, so my background is dance. I taught dance for many years before becoming a yoga teacher just a couple of years ago. And I'm an improviser and I
Mm-hmm.
love to improvise, and I love to inspire people to find their own way and find their own impulse and all of that. And I have found that in teaching yoga, man, I really need to have a plan myself. For my brain, I need to have a plan, because if I don't have a good plan, I mean, my comfort level is actually improvisation, but if I don't have a good plan, and I don't have the sequencing laid out, then I could veer off in a way that it doesn't feel, to me, it doesn't feel like a satisfying class. anyway, that's actually another topic. But what I wanted to get at is that when I'm teaching, I do tend to encourage folks to do their, to make their own choice within the container, right? And so the populations that I'm teaching, I find like there's sort of two things that might happen. One is that someone will come into the restorative class and not really want to be doing restorative maybe. And so they'll take their restorative bridge like in a huge back bend with the block, and I try to encourage the restorative version of the class, but I do allow for options, but to the point where at some times I feel like people might be doing things that could be unsafe for their bodies because they're holding things for too long. For instance, like a big back bend like that. Maybe those students are, well practiced and, they're making their own choices and they're going to be fine with it. But then there's also another version of a person who may, I don't know, just have maybe some alignment trouble, something that like they get into. I'll use the example of like getting into a pose on their back where they're really like their chin sort of jutted out. And so I'll try to help support with something under their head, for instance. However, my question about that end of things, well, one, I have students who are hard of hearing. So to go over to them in class and try to offer them sort of more intimate guidance becomes a bigger thing because it's hard to communicate. Then there's another thing in my mind, which is trauma-informed training, which is much less like walking around the room and, reaching out. So I feel torn between all of those things. So maybe we can consider that like a platter for future conversation, but like I'm torn between all of those things for like how, certainly if I see someone doing something that it seems like it could be unsafe for them, I certainly want to, give them another option, another possibility. But I find myself hesitating at times because I want to let people go through things in their own way also. And I don't want to create those distractions in class that could come because of the reasons I mentioned. So those are a bunch of things on my mind that from your last comments.
Yeah, great. So what I'm hearing there is kind of that intersection of teaching an accessible class, teaching a safe class, teaching to a group, honoring the class description, all the while keeping like your trauma-informed background at the forefront of your mind as well. And like, what do we do?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the improv piece. Versus structure. Cool. That's definitely like a whole talk. That's a whole talk. And what I would say is, I'm not sure if you can attend the office hours in person next week, but if you can't, if you want to email me one specific question, because right now it's just you and Kelly in the mentorship. So I will have time to I will have a decent amount of time to address that specific question. And it'll be recorded. And that's what office hours are. They're questions from you guys. So I'm not coming with any topics. Okay. So if there's like a piece of that you can get really clear on, or something else to say, can you please talk about XYZ?
Awesome. That would be
awesome. With a question, like with a specific question attached to it.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much to dive into. I think one of the things that I would bookmark for me and for you, but for you, like I heard you say that you feel really like improv is like is a place for you that feels good, right? And that's not the case for a lot of people, right? They need so much structure. But what I also heard you say is, but if you don't stick to your class structure, then you're not sure you're delivering I think you used the word satisfactory experience. And I'm really curious, and I hope that comes up in our future conversations around what that means, what you think that means. Are you getting feedback on that, or is that just a story in your head? Like that whole kind of
I do, yeah,
reflection point.
I do think it's a story in my head about safe and intelligent sequencing, I guess. Because
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think that that's all I'll say for right now, but yeah.
Yeah, which is also an interesting thing because if you are teaching an older population,
Mm.
right, they've been living in their bodies for a very long time. And maybe they know their bodies really well. And maybe they don't. And maybe there's like you said, like, but if there's some hearing issues or sensory issues, are they missing those cues and providing on safety? But the bigger thing is like examining that where it's a story for you, because I think in my own practice in my own teaching, when we have the ability to improv and really respond to what's in the room, like that's a real gift and does have the potential to be really powerful because you're tapping into present time. You're not attached to a thing. But the structure is a good thing to bring with you as a fail-safe, as a backup, as a general plan, but then to be able to see what's happening and the willingness to ditch that plan based on what you're seeing is a true skill as a teacher. So I just want to throw that in there before we got off.
Love it. I love it. Yeah.
Cool. All right, good to see your face.
You too. Thank you so much, Maura. I'll see you along the way.
All right, bye, Janine.
Bye.